Hello and welcome to another video. Today we have a rather curious story involving the Kray twins. Some of you will be aware of this story and some of you may not. It's not really a story you see in most books on the Krays. In fact, I don't think I recall ever seeing it in a book. It is the story of the prominent flamboyant showbiz lawyer David Jacobs and his suicide on the 15th of December 1968, which was also rumoured to be murder. David Jacobs was a partner in the firm of M.A. Jacobs Limited of Pall Mall. David was a leading showbiz lawyer in Britain and represented many famous people including Laurence Olivier and Judy Garland. He had represented Liberace in a successful libel case against a Daily Mirror columnist. It was a very high profile case at the time, which was 1959. David Jacobs won the case and Liberace was given £8,000 in damages. The case was that the columnist strongly hinted that Liberace was homosexual, which Liberace strongly denied. The offending line in the article that the libel case was brought about is a mouthful. The columnist wrote describing Liberace:
"He is the summit of sex, the pinnacle of masculine, feminine, and neuter, everything that he, she, and it can ever want. This deadly, winking, sniggering, snuggling, chromium-plated, scent-impregnated, luminous, quivering, giggling, fruit-flavoured, mincing, ice-covered heap of mother love is the biggest sentimental vomit of all time."
The case partly hinged on the use of the term fruit-flavoured, as fruit is an American slang term for homosexual. The columnist denied that he was familiar with this usage. In court, Liberace denied he was gay, stating, "I am against the practice because it offends convention and it offends society." Following his award for damages, Liberace joked in a telegram that "I cried all the way to the bank." Liberace continued to maintain that he was not homosexual throughout his life.
There was never a Mrs. Liberace, except for his late mother, for whom his devotion is well known. Because of that, because of his flamboyant lifestyle and male friends, there have been questions about his sexual preferences. Those rumors used to infuriate him. About 25 years ago, you lodged a libel action in England against a gossip columnist who insinuated that you are not the marrying type.
We're living in such a permissive world that I don't think anybody really much cares whatever anybody does behind closed doors. It's not shocking anymore. It's, I think in the 50s, any publicity along those lines was very daring, and it called for a defense.
So this is the stature of lawyer David Jacobs. He convinced the court that Liberace was not homosexual, and Liberace walked away with £8,000 in damages. David Jacobs was every bit as theatrical as the clients he represented. He was 6'3" tall with dyed black hair. He cut a suave, commanding figure. He shared his tailor with the Prince of Rainier of Monaco. He would appear in court wearing full pancake makeup. He employed a chauffeur to drive his two-tone pink maroon Rolls Royce, and he kept a table on permanent reserve at Le Caprice in Piccadilly, which was a very upmarket restaurant. David Jacobs was homosexual at the time when homosexual acts between men were illegal, and when to be gay was part of a necessarily secretive subterranean world in which prominent figures in show business and society and politics would inevitably have known each other. A gregarious and highly sociable figure, Jacobs was famous for throwing extravagant parties at his home in Chelsea and at the family home in Hove, where his mother continued to live, and where Jacobs built an extension likened to a Miami hotel for entertaining. He had lent the house to Ringo Starr and his new bride Maureen for their honeymoon in 1965. This was David Jacobs' house in Hove, just by the seafront. It is at 2 Prince's Crescent. There is video and pictures of Ringo Starr here after his marriage in 1965. David Jacobs was highly secretive about his own affairs. For 17 years he was in a relationship with a hairdresser, John Barr, who lived in his Chelsea home and whom Jacobs maintained on £1,000 a year. By 1968, Jacobs' life, not least its more secretive aspects, was becoming complicated. Jacobs was admitted to the Priory Clinic, allegedly on the verge of a breakdown. A man called Peter Maddock, who previously worked as Jacobs' clerk and who saw him shortly after he had been discharged from the Priory at a dinner party in Knightsbridge, said David Jacobs was very much a shadow of himself. He'd lost an enormous amount of weight. There was clearly some major issues preying on his mind. A number of things perhaps. It was obvious he was in trouble. A few weeks later, on the 15th of December 1968, David Jacobs was found hanging from a length of satin tied to one of the beams of the garage at his seaside home in Hove. There is the garage at the side of the house here in Prince's Crescent. At the inquest, his brother Basil said that Jacobs had been concerned over tax problems, but that did not seem to be all. It was reported that following his death, police had found almost indecipherable notes in Jacobs' handwriting in his red smoking jacket's pocket, leading them to question a number of young men and several well-known titled people about parties in West End flats and country houses. John Merry, a private investigator who had been employed by David Jacobs, told newspapers that there were certain things going on in Jacobs' life. John Merry later claimed that Jacobs had telephoned him 2 days before his death, saying, "I'm in terrible trouble, they're all after me," and he reeled off names of 6 prominent figures in show business. When the investigator tried to reassure him, Jacobs rang off. The story that interests us most, though, is the story that the Krays were involved in David Jacobs' death. The story is that a man visited David Jacobs sometime in 1968 and said he was there on the behalf of Ronnie Kray. By this time in 1968, the Krays and some of their firm were safely locked away on remand in Brixton Prison. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were due to stand trial for the murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie at the Old Bailey in January 1969 and needed David Jacobs' help. It is alleged that David Jacobs refused the help and then shortly after he sought police protection. It is entirely possible that David Jacobs had crossed paths with the Kray twins in the past, and especially Ronnie. The homosexual circles for most of the 1960s, well, up until 1967, seemed to be quite close-knit between closeted prominent figures, and while Ronnie may not have been classed as a prominent figure at the time in the 1960s, he certainly kept the company of some. As we know, that was prominent people like Robert Boothby, Tom Dryburgh and Francis Bacon, who were also alleged to have been in homosexual circles at the time. If David Jacobs did not know the twins personally through homosexual circles, then I'm sure he would have certainly known about them due to his profession as a lawyer and that the twins and the firm were gaining column inches in the newspapers after being remanded into custody on the charges of murder at their committal proceedings at Bow Street Magistrates Court in the spring of 1968. It is a curious story involving the twins. We don't really have any details on specifics with this. We don't know when David Jacobs would have been approached on behalf of Ronnie Kray. The twins were arrested in May of 1968, and it's possible David Jacobs would have been approached soon after. Later in the year, of course, towards the end of his life, David Jacobs was admitted to the Priory Clinic due to a nervous breakdown. I have been trying to find out when the story originated and where the story came from, but I can't really find much on it. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that it is true. I mean, it could be a believable scenario. After all, the twins were very feared gangsters, and even though they were locked away in Brixton Prison, they were still to be very feared at the time. They still had people on the outside that were probably willing to carry out any threats that needed to be carried out. And just because they were locked away on remand, it was not a foregone conclusion that they would not be freed in the coming months after being acquitted for the murders they were accused of at their trial in January 1969. The Krays demanding money with Menace's trial from 3 years earlier in 1965 would still be fresh in the minds of people, where the Krays and Mad Teddy Smith were acquitted on all charges. A friend and former employee of David Jacobs, Peter Maddock, dismissed any notion of the Krays' involvement into the suicide of David Jacobs and said that Jacobs was not involved with gangsters as it was not his style. But I suppose nobody knew that Lord Boothby and Tom Dryburgh were involved with gangsters until it all came out in 1964. As I said earlier, the world of homosexuals was closely guarded, at least until 1967, as until then homosexual practices were illegal. It is certainly not beyond the realms of possibility that Ronnie Kray, or Reggie for that matter, encountered David Jacobs at a number of homosexual parties that they attended. We definitely know that Ronnie Kray at least did attend homosexual parties during the early part of the 1960s and maybe later. 2 days before David Jacobs' death, he posted a Christmas card to his friend, the playwright Robert Morgan, which read, "All love and best wishes for the new year, David." This seemed quite strange to people at the time, that he would send out a Christmas card just before hanging himself in his garage 2 days later. This led to speculation that he could have been murdered, which in turn leads to speculation that the Krays were involved due to David Jacobs turning down the twins' request for help with their upcoming trial at the Old Bailey. Of course, a lot can happen in the mind over 2 days if you're in some kind of trouble and looking for a way out. David Jacobs' suicide does not seem to be premeditated. Young English actress Susanna Lee, who moments after hearing of Jacobs' passing received an invitation to lunch in the post from the recently deceased lawyer. Susanna said, "I was holding the newspaper telling me he was dead in one hand and a postcard inviting me to lunch in the other." So that tells us it was unlikely to be a premeditated act of suicide and more spur of the moment thing. His carrying on as normal before his death, like the Christmas card being posted and his invitation to Susanna Lee for lunch, has probably fueled speculation that he could have been murdered, and for it to look like it was suicide. I don't know much about forensics back in the 1960s, but I would assume it could be easier to fake a scene like that than it would be in these modern times. A murder being covered up as a suicide. To further fuel speculation that the Krays were involved in David Jacobs' death, or more specifically Ronnie Kray, There is rumours that Ronnie was somehow involved in Reggie Kray's first wife Francis's death in June 1967, which was ruled at the time as suicide due to barbiturate poisoning. These rumours have been around for quite a while now. These rumours, I believe, were started by Reggie Kray's prison friend Bradley Allardyce in 2002. Bradley says that Reggie wanted to tell Bradley about the thing that haunted him the most. Bradley went on to say about that moment, "I was sitting in my cell with Reg and it was one of those nights. We turned the lights down low and put some nice music on, and sometimes Reg would reminisce. He suddenly broke down and said, 'I'm going to tell you something I've only ever told 2 people, and something I've carried around with me.' He put his head on my shoulder and told me Ron killed Francis." So going by if this was true, Ronnie Kray would be no stranger to orchestrating a murder to look like suicide. On Reggie's deathbed interview, there was a lingering unanswered question of who the one more killing was. When it was asked by the interviewer if there was any more killings, and Reggie said 1.
Do you think the Home Office reacted against giving you parole because they thought maybe there had been other killings?
I'm sure this was part of their reasoning for not giving me parole. There's one feature of it anyway.
Were there any other killings?
One.
Most people at the time assumed it was Kray firm member Mad Teddy Smith. Even the detective on the Kray case, Leonard Nipper Reed, said the one more murder was Teddy Smith, but this was proved to be wrong when evidence of Teddy still being alive until 2004 was produced by historian Ray Rose. Could David Jacobs be the one more killing? I can't really offer any conclusion to all this, as there is no conclusion. The rumours are out there, like all the other rumours about the Kray twins, and that is what they are, rumours. We have no evidence at all to go on that the twins were involved in the death of David Jacobs. Is it possible that the Krays contacted Jacobs to help them at their upcoming trial at the start of 1969? Yes, that is possible. After all, he was a very well-known successful lawyer in that period of time. You have to remember though that the twins had a successful team of lawyers headed by Manny Freedy already. Well, successful in the eyes of the twins. Manny Freedy and his team got the Krays and Teddy Smith acquitted of all charges of demanding money with menaces in their very high profile trial at the Old Bailey in 1965. Of course, these new charges of murder were much more serious, but it did make sense for the twins to stick with a winning formula. I don't believe the twins were involved in the death of David Jacobs, as in murder. There's no clear answer as to why Jacobs killed himself. He definitely had some serious things on his mind, and he was a very troubled man towards the end of his life. It is possible that the suicide was murder, but I find it unlikely that the Krays were involved directly in that sense. In my opinion, we can rule out that Ronnie Kray had experience with making murder look like suicide. I don't believe that he killed or had any involvement in the death of Francis Shay. I think Reggie told Bradley Allardyce many things, but I don't think that Ronnie Kray killing his first wife Frances was one of them. It's a good story to sell to the tabloids though, if you have not long come out of prison and you need a bit of money, like Bradley Allardyce probably did. It is possible that the Krays did ask David Jacobs for help and then put pressure on him when he refused, which could have been on top of other problems, which then led to him taking his own life. I don't think he is the one more that Reggie talks about in his final interview. I always have believed and still believe that Reggie is talking about Frank Mitchell as the one more killing. While not being killed directly at the twins' hands, they certainly ordered the killing of Frank Mitchell. So I think that is the one more. I don't think there's much more I can say on the case of David Jacobs, apart from we can file the Kray's involvement of actual murder under the Kray twins myth section. The reasons why David Jacobs took his own life will never truly be known. If you have any thoughts on this story of David Jacobs, then you're welcome to put them in the comment section below. But I don't think there's much more I can say on this. I'd like to thank you all for your suggestions for future videos that you put in the comment section of my last video, and I will definitely look into some of them. So that's about it for now. I will thank you all for watching, and I will see you again in the next one.